Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your ATM card has been locked, the supermarket shelves are empty, and the cash in your pocket has suddenly turned into nothing more than worthless paper. Many people think bankruptcy only happens to companies, but that is not true. A country can go bankrupt as well. When that happens, the country itself is still there. People are still living their normal lives, and the government is still operating. But what collapses is the world's trust in that country. And once that trust disappears, a chain reaction of economic problems begins to unfold. So, what does it really mean when a country goes bankrupt or defaults on its debt? Why do countries fall into default in the first place? What happens afterward? And can a country actually recover? All of those questions will be explained in today's video. So stay with me until the end, because the story behind a national default can be far more complex and surprising than you might think. What does it mean when a country defaults? To make things easier to understand, imagine a country as if it were Bobo's bakery running an entire economy. Bobo is the bakery owner who represents the government. To get money to buy more modern ovens, build a larger flour storage warehouse, and pay the salaries of the bakers, Bobo goes to Lulu, a wealthy investor, to borrow a large amount of money. The two of them sign an agreement stating that every month Bobo must repay part of the principal, along with a certain amount of interest. At first, everything goes smoothly. The bakery is busy with customers, and Bobo makes his payments regularly. But one day, the business runs into trouble. The price of flour suddenly skyrockets, and people start buying less bread, which quickly drains the bakery's cash reserves. At that point, Bobo has to meet Lulu and admit, "I no longer have enough money to pay this month's interest as I promised." In the world of finance, when a country cannot repay its debt on time as agreed, that situation is called a default. The key difference between national debt and personal debt lies in how it is handled. If Bobo were just an ordinary person borrowing money to buy a house, then when he failed to repay the loan, Lulu could take him to court. The court could then send officials to seize his house and confiscate his property. But when it comes to a country, Lulu cannot send people to physically carry away Bobo's city hall, and he cannot close the country's borders or force the citizens baking bread to leave their own land. In reality, the world does not have a single Supreme Court with absolute power to seize a country's territory or public assets simply because that country owes money. That is why national bankruptcy is not about losing land or losing buildings. What truly collapses is trust, something invisible yet absolutely fundamental to the entire economy. The moment Bobo announces that he cannot repay his debt, Lulu and every other lender around the world will immediately slam their wallets shut. No one will dare lend Bobo another dollar because they are afraid of losing everything. At that point, Bobo's country becomes like a car speeding down the road that suddenly runs out of fuel. The bakery is still there, the ovens are still there, but without capital to buy ingredients, and without anyone willing to do business anymore, the entire operation begins to grind to a halt. National bankruptcy is essentially when a government admits that it has lost its ability to repay its debts, which leads to financial isolation from the rest of the world and pushes the country into a severe crisis. Why do countries default? When a country defaults and loses the trust of the world, the big question is, what actually led to that situation? To understand that, let us go back to the story of Bobo's bakery. In reality, Bobo borrowing money from Lulu at the beginning was a reasonable decision because it helped the bakery grow faster. With that capital, Bobo could buy more ovens, expand the shop, and hire more workers. As long as business was good, he could easily make his debt payments on time. Countries do the same thing. Governments borrow money to build roads, hospitals, and schools in order to stimulate economic growth. However, problems begin to appear when the debt becomes too large compared with the ability to repay it. From that moment on, the risk of default starts to form. The first cause is the trap known as borrowing too much. After the bakery starts doing well, Bobo becomes more ambitious and decides to expand aggressively. He keeps borrowing more money to open new branches and upgrade his equipment. But because of poor calculations, the amount of money Bobo must repay to Lulu every month keeps growing, until eventually all the profit from selling bread is just enough to pay the interest. To keep the business running and repay the old debt, Bobo is forced to approach other lenders to borrow more money to fill the gap. He takes new loans to repay the old ones, and then borrows again to pay the interest on those new loans. This behavior creates an endless vicious cycle, forming a massive debt trap. Instead of using profits from selling bread to reinvest or improve the bakery, every drop of sweat and every bit of income now gets swallowed by this trap, just to keep up with the growing interest payments. In economics, this situation is known as a debt trap. The second cause is the risk of borrowing in foreign currencies. This is one of the most common mistakes behind global financial crises. Bobo earns money in Bobo coin from customers buying bread in town, but Lulu demands repayment in United States dollars. When Bobo first takes the loan, the exchange rate is low. Selling bread and earning 10 Bobo coin is enough to exchange for $1 to repay the debt. However, when economic instability causes the town's currency to lose value, the exchange rate shoots up. Now Bobo must spend as much as 50 Bobo coin just to exchange for $1. Even though the number of loaves he bakes and sells remains the same, the amount of money Bobo needs to gather enough dollars to repay Lulu has increased 5 times. The debt suddenly becomes a massive rock crushing the bakery. Not because Bobo became lazy or started baking worse bread, but simply because the value of the currency changed. The third cause is unexpected economic shocks. Sometimes a country defaults because of external factors beyond its control. If the price of flour suddenly rises sharply, or people cut their spending, and the bakery's revenue drops dramatically, Bobo will immediately face financial trouble. In the real world, these shocks can include pandemics, wars, or the collapse of commodity prices. A clear example is Venezuela. The country relies heavily on oil exports. When global oil prices collapsed from around $100 to nearly $40 per barrel in 2014, the Venezuelan government's revenue plunged, quickly pushing the economy into crisis and increasing the risk of default. In a very short time, the income that once supported the entire economy almost disappeared. The fourth cause is political instability. Imagine that one day Bobo is no longer managing the bakery and a new owner takes over. This new owner might declare that the previous debts were unfair or illegitimate and simply decide not to repay them. In reality, Ecuador did something similar in 2008, when a new government refused to recognize debts issued by the previous administration. Although this decision helped reduce debt temporarily, it severely damaged the confidence of international investors, making the country's ability to borrow money for future development extremely uncertain. What happens when a country defaults? As we have seen, just one major shock can cause a country's revenue to suddenly collapse. And when income is no longer enough to repay debts, that country can fall into default. But the worrying part is that default is not the end of the story. In fact, it is only the beginning of many serious problems. To visualize this more clearly, let us return to Bobo's bakery and see how the domino chain of crisis unfolds. The first consequence is the collapse of investor confidence. The moment Bobo officially tells Lulu that he cannot repay his debt on time, the news spreads across the entire town. People who previously lent money to Bobo panic because they fear losing everything. They rush to sell their debt claims or pull their money out of the bakery as quickly as possible. The same thing happens in reality. When a country defaults, investors shut their wallets because they no longer believe that country will repay its debts. The financial connection between that country and the rest of the world is effectively cut off. The second consequence is a dramatic collapse of the national currency. As trust falls, people start abandoning Bobo coin and exchanging it for United States dollars to protect their wealth. If previously $1 could be exchanged for 10 Bobo coin, after the crisis, that number could jump to 50 or even 100 Bobo coin. This means Bobo now has to spend far more money just to buy the same amount of goods as before. As a result, the value of the country's assets can evaporate in a very short time. The third consequence is a wave of inflation that wipes out people's purchasing power. When the currency loses value, everything imported from outside, such as flour, fuel, or medicine, becomes far more expensive. Bobo is forced to raise the price of bread to cover his costs, which means ordinary people like Mimi suddenly become poorer, even though they are still working just as hard. If a loaf of bread once cost 10 coins, it could now rise to 500 coins. Inflation directly erodes purchasing power and pushes people into severe hardship. The fourth consequence is something known as a bank run, a wave of mass withdrawals. When people hear that the bakery has defaulted and the economy is unstable, Mimi and thousands of other citizens fear that their savings might disappear. They rush to the banks to withdraw their money at the same time. Because banks do not keep all deposits in cash, they quickly run out of money and are forced to close temporarily or limit withdrawals. This creates the painful situation where people technically have money in their accounts but cannot access it to buy food. Finally, the country falls into economic recession and social crisis. With limited capital and fewer raw materials, Bobo has to reduce production, shut down branches, and lay off workers. Unemployment skyrockets, other businesses collapse as well, and the entire economic picture becomes dark and uncertain. When people are hungry and their future looks hopeless, anger can erupt into protests and social unrest. Only then does Bobo realize that default is not just numbers written in accounting books. It is a crisis that can directly affect the daily lives of every citizen, from their jobs and income to the food on their table. After a default, can a country recover? After going through the terrifying domino chain of a national default, the big question is whether Bobo's bakery can actually get back on its feet and recover. In reality, a country absolutely can rise again from the rubble, but that journey is extremely difficult and requires some very painful trade-offs. The first and most critical step is a process called debt restructuring, often referred to as a haircut. At this point, Bobo can no longer avoid the problem and must sit down with Lulu and the other creditors to negotiate. He has to admit that he cannot repay the full amount on time and ask for part of the debt to be reduced or for the repayment period to be extended. For example, if Lulu agrees to receive only $60 instead of the original $100, then the $40 difference becomes the haircut that immediately reduces Bobo's financial pressure. Thanks to that concession, the bakery finally has some breathing room and can start focusing on maintaining its most essential operations instead of constantly scrambling just to pay interest. Next, when no one else is willing to lend money, Bobo usually has to turn to international lifelines such as the International Monetary Fund. However, this rescue money comes with extremely harsh austerity conditions. To receive that financial assistance, Bobo must accept strict requirements. He is forced to slash spending as much as possible, raise the price of bread to generate more income, and even sell some of the bakery's valuable ovens. These measures allow the bakery to keep operating and maintain its equipment. But the downside is that ordinary people like Mimi will face greater hardship. Bread becomes more expensive, and many previous forms of support are cut. In other words, this is the price many defaulted countries must pay to stabilize their economies and slowly regain access to international financial markets. Real recovery only arrives when Bobo carries out economic reforms and stays committed to them for many years. He has to completely change the way he manages the bakery, strictly control the budget, and make sure he never falls into a debt trap again. This process often takes 5 to 15 years before lost trust can truly be restored. A clear example is Uruguay in the year 2002. After suffering a severe banking crisis, the country implemented strong reforms and eventually became one of the most stable economies in South America. However, even after a successful recovery, the scar from a default remains in the minds of investors for a very long time. It reminds them that trust is easy to lose but extremely difficult to rebuild from scratch. Can rich countries default? In reality, even the richest countries in the world can default. However, the risks and the way they deal with those risks are very different from Bobo's situation. The most obvious example is the United States, the country with the largest economy on the planet. The key difference is that the United States borrows money in its own currency, the United States dollar, which it has the power to print. Because of this, the country almost always has the resources needed to repay its debts without worrying about running out of foreign currency like Bobo. However, this power also comes with a major cost. If too much money is printed to pay debts, the value of the currency will fall, and the country can be pushed into a massive wave of inflation. The fierce debates over the government debt ceiling in the United States in 2011 and again in 2023 were essentially high-stakes political battles. At certain moments, the country came dangerously close to a technical default simply because political leaders could not agree on raising the borrowing limit. Another example is Japan, a country with an enormous public debt that exceeds 200% of its gross domestic product. This figure is far larger than the levels seen in many countries that have previously collapsed. Yet Japan has remained stable thanks to its unique debt structure. Instead of borrowing mainly from demanding foreign investors like Lulu, most of Japan's debt is actually held by its own citizens, domestic banks, and the Bank of Japan. It is similar to Bobo borrowing money from family members rather than from outsiders. Because the creditors are essentially family, they tend to be more patient, more trusting, and less likely to panic and run when problems arise. This greatly reduces Japan's risk of default compared with what many analysts once predicted. The difference in size and global influence gives these economic superpowers more tools to prevent a collapse. But that does not mean they are invincible. If global confidence in the world's strongest reserve currencies, such as the United States dollar or the Japanese yen, were ever seriously shaken, the consequences would not stop with a single bakery. It could trigger a breakdown across the entire global financial system. In the end, whether a country is rich or poor, the most important lesson always returns to the same fundamental truth. The stability of a nation depends on its credibility and its ability to maintain the world's trust in its future, not simply on how much money it has in its vaults. Through Bobo's story, we can clearly see one reality. When a country goes bankrupt, the biggest collapse is the loss of trust from the rest of the world. A default is like a bakery losing its reputation. It can trigger a chain reaction that includes a collapsing currency, runaway inflation, and a frozen banking system. And in the end, the people who suffer the most are ordinary citizens. They must deal with rising unemployment, shrinking incomes, and a steadily increasing cost of living. A country can still recover after a crisis by restructuring its debt and carrying out difficult economic reforms. However, the scar on its financial reputation often remains in the eyes of investors for a very long time. Ultimately, this story shows that the stability and prosperity of a nation depend on its ability to manage its economy wisely and maintain the world's trust in its financial commitments.